Hey there guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Deep Rock Galactic running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U on this TRIGKEY Speed S5 mini PC. And that's pairing a Ryzen 5 5500U with 16 gigabytes of 3200 megatransfers, DDR4 memory, but this is SODIMM memory, which means it runs at JEDEC speed. That means that you are getting looser timings than the memory that you would normally have on a desktop that would usually have XMP. With that said though, this should give you pretty much relative performance to what you should be able to get on practically any system with this chip, as long as you have an adjustable TDP that you can set all the way to 25 watts. That is what you're going to need to be able to maximize the performance of the Ryzen 5 5500U. But jumping right on into the actual game itself, here you're looking at the game running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but we are at 100% render resolution. Back before they actually added FSR into it, if you would set things to the lowest graphics settings, it would actually set your target render resolution to something extremely low. This time around, setting everything to the lowest settings does actually keep the render resolution at 100%, but the game does support FSR as well as traditional render resolution scaling, if that is something that you want to use. Now, gaming at 1080p was fine enough most of the time. It really depends on the type of mission that you're doing. The type of mission that you're looking at here is pretty much the kind where you just have to go and repair a bunch of the mules. A lot less action most of the time, a lot more exploring around and mining, so a lot of that actually ends up performing really well. And if you look at those frame time charts, for the most part they're pretty decent. You'll see spikes here and there, but usually it's only when really intense effects are happening. Unfortunately, this really starts to fall apart as things get more intense, and specifically towards the late game of any mission that you're doing. Here you can see in the exact same mission here that we are now at the end game section for this specific mission, and what ends up happening is that as you're waiting for things to get loaded up on this dropship, you can get the hell out of here, you have to repair a lot of things, connect fuel stations and stuff like that, and all this while hordes of enemies are coming at you. Now, performance is also going to be impacted if you're playing with friends. How much this is going to affect things, again, really just depends on the type of mission that we're talking about here. These types of missions are relatively chill most of the time, but they can get really hectic. And if you look at those frame time charts, they're not exactly looking great. There's a lot of spikes happening here up to almost the mid-20s in terms of milliseconds. So we're going from low single digits to suddenly going into the mid-20s, sometimes even into the 30s for the milliseconds. So actually playing this, actually looking around, feels pretty awful for the most part. And again, it is the inconsistency going on there. Now, if we use FSR, we can improve things pretty noticeably. Here we're taking a look at FSR running with the performance preset. So this is the lowest quality of FSR that you can put onto here. Personally, I was actually kind of impressed by how well this looks. There is certainly a lack of detail that is noticeable if you're looking at it. Like if you're specifically looking for that, then yes, I can understand if you just cannot stomach the drop in quality. But for me personally, this was actually just such a huge improvement. I ended up playing 2 different missions on this specific configuration just to make sure that everything was absolutely perfect. Because what ended up happening is that in the late game for both of them, the FPS for 1% lows pretty much only ended up dropping an extra 5 FPS at the worst. So in the absolute most brutal situations, we really weren't losing out on much FPS. And the thing is that in most situations, that frame time chart was actually really consistent. So I would recommend using FSR if performance is too brutal for you. I also did try it with ultra quality. Ultra quality was just actually a slight reduction in terms of the performance here, as you would expect since it's technically running at a higher resolution, but it was far closer to what the performance was like with performance than it was at running native. So while we're not going to be hitting as high of an FPS as this, if you wanted to use ultra quality, well, you could get away with it, or you could use quality or balance. It really just depends. I personally feel like the art style of this game actually lends itself pretty well to these lower resolutions and upscaling techniques, and I would just take full advantage of it to maximize your performance, because this is one of those games that can be very difficult to just benchmark normally because of the fact that there's no built-in benchmark and there is huge variations in what you're going to be doing from mission to mission. But FSR pretty much keeps the performance extremely consistent, where you're only really going to see spikes in the absolute most intense situations, and a lot of the times these aren't really going to be causing you much of a problem, as opposed to 1080p. full resolution, where sometimes it would actually drop down into the 20s for like a split second, which does not feel great. But overall, I do actually recommend you play this game. It performs really, really well on the system, especially because FSR just does a fantastic job in this game. So it definitely gets my recommendation here. And if you're wondering why I have the activate Windows symbol there, apparently this TRIGKEY, when I upgraded its SSD, normally when you upgrade your SSD, Windows will stay activated because most of the time the codes are actually tied to the motherboard itself. So if I just reinstalled Windows on a motherboard that has already been activated with Windows, then it's just going to activate automatically as long as that board is still there. In this case, though, it really didn't seem to do that. So I'm not 100% sure why the TRIGKEY just did not carry over its licensing key. I don't know if it's tied to the actual SSD or something else, but it is something that I've noticed recently. But anyways, I definitely recommend that you check out this game. And of course, if you're interested in picking up the TRIGKEY Speed S5 mini PC with the Ryzen 5 5500U or the 5800H, which is actually currently on sale now for not that much more in comparison to the 5500U. And we're talking about now going up to 8 cores, going up to a much higher TDP that you could adjust anywhere from 35 all the way up to 54 if you wanted to. I would not recommend doing that though. I would recommend just sticking it to around 35, maybe 45 if you're really, really into the CPU performance. But at the price point that it's at, I would actually really consider picking up the 5800H version. It's not going to give you insane improvements in terms of the FPS. So if gaming is all you care about, I would honestly just stick with this one if you're really strapped for cash. But if you got the disposable income, that extra core, the extra clock speed on it for the iGPU, and the increase in CPU performance, as well as having more CPU cores in general, seems pretty worth it for the $40 to $60 price difference between the two systems right now. So I definitely would consider that. But I'll catch you in the next one.